Welcome back to our Advanced User Interface Technologies lecture series. In today's session, we are going to learn one of the most important topics in React development, controlled and uncontrolled forms. Whenever users interact with a website, they usually fill out some type of form. For example, login form, registration form, student admission form, online shopping checkout, feedback form, contact us form, etc. Every modern web application depends on forms because forms are the primary way users send information to an application. In HTML, creating forms is straightforward. However, React introduces its own way of handling form data. React offers two approaches, controlled forms and uncontrolled forms. By the end of today's lecture, you will understand both approaches and know exactly when to use each one. Let's get started. Before we, before we begin, let's understand what we will learn today. After completing this lecture, you should be able to explain the purpose of forms in React, understand controlled forms, understand uncontrolled forms, create controlled forms using the useState hook, create uncontrolled forms using the useReference hook, compare both approaches and decide which one is suitable for different applications. These concepts are asked very frequently in React interviews, practical examinations, and placement interviews. Introduction to forms. Now let's begin with a basic question. What exactly is a form? A form is simply a user interface that allows users to enter information and submit it to a website or application. Whenever we type something into a website, we are interacting with a form. For example, suppose if you visit a Gmail, whenever you type your email address and password and click sign in, that is a form. When you register for an online course, you enter your name, phone number, email, and password. Again, that's a form. Similarly, when you order food online, you enter your delivery address and payment details. That is also a form. React applications use forms everywhere because applications constantly need input from the users. Common form elements. A form can contain different types of input controls. For example, text box, password field, email field, radio button, checkbox, drop down list, text area, submit button. Each of these serves a different purpose. For example, a text box collects names, a password field hides sensitive information, checkboxes allows multiple selections, radio buttons allows only one selection, drop down list reduce typing by offering predefined choices, text areas allows users to write longer messages, buttons submit the collected information. Let's take a real world example. Imagine you are creating an online college admission portal. Students can enter name, register number, email, mobile number, department, date of birth. After clicking the submit button, all of this information is sent to the server. This entire interaction is handled using forms. So forms are one of the most fundamental concepts in web development. Forms in React. Now comes an important question. How does React manage form data? React provides two approaches. The first approach is controlled forms. In controlled forms, React itself manages every input value. Whenever the user types even a single character, React immediately stores that value in its state. The component state always contains the latest value entered by the user. React becomes the single source of truth. This means React always knows the exact value inside every input field. The second approach, uncontrolled forms. In uncontrolled forms, React does not store every value. Instead, the browser's DOM stores the values. React reads those values only when required using useReference. The key difference is controlled form, React controls the data. In uncontrolled form, the browser controls the data. Let's take a simple analogy. Imagine a classroom test. In the first classroom, a teacher checks every answer immediately after a student writes it. That is like a controlled form. In the second classroom, the teacher waits until the student submits the answer sheet. Only then the answers are checked. That is like an uncontrolled form. Controlled forms. Now let's study the controlled forms in detail. A controlled form is a form in which React stores and manages every input value using the component state. The React hook used here is useState. Whenever the user types, the following process happens. The user types, then onChange event occurs, and then React updates the state, and then the component re-renders, then the updated value appears on the screen. The cycle happens every time the user presses a key. For example, suppose if you type the word React, when you press R, React stores R. When you press E, React stores RE. When you press A, React stores REA. This continues until the complete word is stored. That is why controlled forms always know the current value. Why is this useful? Because React can perform validation instantly. Suppose a password must contain at least 8 characters. As the user types, React continuously checks the password length. If it is too short, React immediately displays an error message. Similarly, email validation, phone number validation, password strength, character counters, live search, autocomplete all become easy because React always has access to the latest input value. That is why controlled forms are widely used in large React applications. How do we implement them in React using useState? In the next part, we will write a controlled form, understand every line of the code, and discuss its advantages and disadvantages, and then move on to uncontrolled forms using useReference. Now, let's take the controlled form example. Here is the code. Import useState from React. This line imports the useState hook from React. Think of a hook as a special function provided by React that gives additional features. The useState hook allows us to create variables that React continuously monitors. Whenever the value changes, React automatically updates the web page. Look into the next line. Constant name, set name equal to useState. This line creates a state variable. There are actually two things here. The first one is name. This stores the current value. Initially it is an empty string. The second one is set name. This function updates the value of name. Suppose initially name equal to double quotes. User types A. Now React executes set name of A. Then the value becomes name equal to A. Every single keystroke updates the React state. The next line, value equal to name. This is one of the most important lines. It connects the text box to React state. Instead of storing data inside the browser, React stores it inside the name. Whatever is stored inside the variable immediately appears inside the text box. This is why we call it as a controlled form. React controls the text box. The next line, onChange line. This line executes whenever the user types. Now let us see the flow. User presses a key, then the onChange event occurs, then the event object contains the latest value, and then setName function updates the React state, and then the React automatically refreshes the page, and then the text box displays the latest value. This process happens within milliseconds. The user never notices it. Let's take a simple real-time example. Suppose your college website asks students to enter a mobile number. The mobile number must contain exactly 10 digits. As soon as the student types 123, React immediately displays, please enter a valid 10-digit mobile number. The student does not have to press submit. Validation happens instantly. This is one of the biggest advantages of controlled forms. Now let's discuss the advantages and disadvantages of controlled forms. Easy validation. Since React always knows the latest value, it can validate the input immediately. Real-time updates. Suppose a website shows the characters remaining as the user types, the counter changes automatically. Only the controlled forms can easily achieve this. Predictable data flow. All information stays inside React. There is only one source of truth. This makes debugging much easier. Dynamic forms. Imagine a job application. If the applicant selects the experienced, additional fields appear. If the applicant selects fresher, those fields disappear. Controlled forms handle such dynamic interfaces very easily. Disadvantages. It takes more code compared to the HTML. React requires useState, onChange, value, and state variables, so the code becomes longer. Frequent re-rendering. Every key press refreshes the component. For small forms, this is fine, but imagine a hospital management system with 150 input fields. Every key press causes React to update. This can slightly affect the performance. Therefore, developers sometimes choose another approach. That approach is called controlled forms. Uncontrolled forms. Unlike the controlled forms, React does not store every value. Instead, the browser itself stores the data. React reads the value only when needed. To do this, React uses another hook called useReference. You can think of useReference as creating a direct reference to an HTML element. Instead of asking React, we directly ask the browser, what is the value inside this text box? The browser replies with the current value. This approach reduces React's workload because React does not update its state every after keystroke. That means less processing, less rendering, better performance, especially for very simple forms. Let's take a simple real life analogy. Imagine filling an examination answer sheet. The examiner does not check every answer while you are writing. Instead, the examiner waits until you submit the answer sheet. Only then all the answers are checked. That is exactly how an uncontrolled form works. Let's take one example for the uncontrolled form. First, it uses the use reference. It creates a reference. This reference points to the text box. Next, the text box is connected using ref equal to input ref. Now React knows exactly which text box we are referring to. As the user types, React does absolutely nothing. No state updates, no re-rendering. The browser simply stores the value. Finally, when the submit button is clicked, React executes input reference.current value. Now it reads the text box value. Only at this moment does React access the data. This makes uncontrolled forms much faster for smaller applications such as contact forms, search boxes, newsletter subscription, feedback forms, simple login forms, because React performs much less work. So far, we have learned how controlled forms work using use state, why they are ideal for validation and dynamic user interfaces, how controlled forms are uses use reference function to access form values only when required. Now let's discuss the advantages and disadvantages of uncontrolled forms. Less code, better performance for simpler forms, fewer re-renders, easy to integrate with traditional HTML forms. So these are the advantages. Some disadvantages include difficult to validate input in real time, less control over user input, harder to implement the dynamic behavior. Controlled versus uncontrolled forms. React always knows the current value of every input field. In an uncontrolled form, the data is stored inside the DOM, which means the browser itself manages the input values. React access the value only when required. So remember this simple rule. Controlled forms, React stores the data. Uncontrolled forms, browser stores the data. The controlled forms use the use state function because React continuously updates the state. Uncontrolled forms use the use reference because React simply creates a reference to the HTML element. Who controls the input? This is probably the easiest point to remember. In controlled forms, React controls everything. Every key press updates the React. In uncontrolled forms, the browser controls everything. React simply asks for the value when necessary. The form validation. Suppose you are creating a student registration form, the email should contain at. The phone number should have exactly 10 digits. Which approach is better? Definitely the controlled forms because React always knows the latest value. Users receive the instant feedback that creates a better user experience. Re-rendering, this is another important point. Control, Controlled forms re-render after every key press. Uncontrolled forms never re-render while typing. The browser stores everything. React only checks the values when the user clicks the submit. Therefore, uncontrolled forms generally provide better performance for simple applications. which is best for large projects. Large enterprise applications usually choose controlled forms because they require live validation, dynamic forms, conditional fields, autocomplete, real time search, error highlighting. Form the libraries like Formic or React Hook Form. Simple websites generally choose uncontrolled forms because they require less code. Let's quickly revise everything we learned today. Today we understood what forms are in React, why forms are essential for collecting the user input, controlled forms use React state with use state, uncontrolled forms use the DOM with use reference, controlled forms provide excellent validation and dynamic behavior, uncontrolled forms are simpler and efficient for basic forms. The choice depends on the application's complexity and requirements. Before we end today's session, let me leave you with one important key takeaway. There is no single approach that is always the best. If your application requires real time validation, dynamic user interfaces, and complex interactions, choose controlled forms. If your application is simple and you only need the form values after submission, uncontrolled forms are a practical and lightweight choice. Understanding both approaches will help you build better React applications and real world development. Thank you for watching this lecture. See you in the next lecture. Happy coding!